ultimately treat everyone with the utmost respect, but you kind of got to be a private investigator where you're looking for fraud on every single application. And if you're not willing or able to do that, again, that's the part that can be kind of draining and where you can miss those red flags. Welcome to the Investment Property Geeks of Charlotte. We're your hosts, Chris
and Jesse.
And today we're going to be talking about Russian roulette, tenant screening and selection.
We went back and forth on that name, but we're sticking with it.
It's perhaps a little crass, but hey, if you can't have fun, get out.
And it drives the point home, and you'll see why shortly.
Now, tenant screening and selection, maybe not so much a game of chance, but to some degree it is, which, I kind of, it's kind of hard to say. Russian roulette, not so much a game. Certainly, I don't know, maybe it is a game, a chance involved, but we did want to kind of highlight the gravity of the importance of selecting the right tenant. And look, even if you have really awesome, super tight criteria, you're not always going to get the world's perfect tenant in the property. Folks always look different on paper than when you experience them in real life. And we'll be talking about that here on a later episode that Chris Loebsack is going to help us out with about like lease enforcement and rent collection. So he'll kind of help us with, hey, assuming you did everything right in the screening process and that person you got isn't quite as good as you'd hoped for, now what do you do? So we'll get there. But really, if you get your selection right in the front end, you're going to eliminate most of the problems most of the time.
Right, exactly. And anytime I'm having conversations with any prospective owners, tenant screening is one of the first things that comes up. Hey, how do you screen your tenants? So it's incredibly important. And if you think about it, we're trying to place someone into a property that is going to be maintaining your home. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep. Hey, please do take a minute or so. It doesn't take long to leave us a review by clicking on that star button within your app, or subscribe to the show. Again, reviews and subscriptions, that's how other folks will find us. So if you find this content valuable, which I really hope you do, hey, the only way I figure people can listen to us for an hour is if they find value in the content. Otherwise, they'd probably turn off a little bit sooner than that.
Or they're very bored during quarantine, so you never know. But
hopefully we make it light and fun, but there are probably more entertaining podcasts out there. Really, we want you to have some good solid nuggets to take away to be able to manage your property a little better. But yeah, review, subscribe, and then hey, drop us a note at podcast@investmentpropertygeeks.com or our website, investmentpropertygeeks.com. You can also check us out on Facebook by the same name.
Yeah, we definitely would love your feedback. And to Chris's point, if you want this to be more fun and you want us to start adding jokes, make that suggestion.
Yeah, maybe you could even give us some really awful jokes to tell,
We're all about dad jokes. Those are the best. So,
true story.
But yes, yeah, and I kind of alluded to this already. Tenant screening and selection arguably is one of the most important decisions that you are going to be making as a property manager, whether you're doing this on your own or doing it for others. That tenant that you're selecting to come in can either make or break you as a property manager, I think.
Yeah.
Having someone who is clean, quiet, considerate, pays on time, does not have any issues is a lot different than the squeaky wheel that's going to be coming in and, having parties and annoying the neighbors and potentially damaging the property. I mean, there's a litany of things that can go wrong with the wrong tenant. So that's why getting the right one and doing some homework and really knowing how to do that homework is going to be so important.
Yeah, absolutely true. I think most of the folks that come to us who have a tenant in place already and they're having challenges, or they're just sick and tired of managing property, tired of being a landlord, they say, is because they didn't get the right tenant in there.
Yeah.
And what really stinks to me is because, hey, yeah, this is about management, but really the reason we focus on management is because that's what helps you have a profitable property. And the reason we want you to have a profitable property is because real estate can really do cool things for you in your life to help you reach your financial goals. I mean, let's be honest. We're not just renting out property because we think it's fun. There's a lot of this that really isn't that much fun, but the fun part is getting to live the life you want to live eventually because you've worked hard to kind of build this portfolio for yourself. So I guess what I'm saying is what really sucks to see is when I see people who sell their investment property, air quotes for those, for those who aren't watching the video, for those who sell their investment property because they're like, I just don't like being a landlord. And then you think about, well, why don't you like being a landlord? Well, because I had a really bad experience with this really awful tenant. Well, that was a bad tenant selection. Like you made a bad decision on putting that tenant in there. It's not that being a landlord necessarily was the wrong decision for you.
Right.
It's that you let your one mistake tell you that you never ever want to do this again. And it's like, well, why don't you just hire someone to, help you manage a property?
Yep.
Then you still get to be a real estate investor. You still keep the property. You still get all the benefits. But you get to take away that portion. Because let's be honest with you, it actually, like I tell people all the time, there are some people who are built for property management. Mm-hmm. If you love numbers and you are totally okay with conflict and telling, a single woman with 5 children, hey, I'm really sorry you didn't pay rent this month, but you're going to have to go out when she's like crying in front of you and telling you, hey, you're going to put us out on the street, and you got to basically say, it's not like we say it like this, but you kind of got to go, yep.
Yeah.
Like you have to be willing to do that, but then you also at the same time have to be super compassionate and on top of it and understand the law. And like some people are built that way and they have that kind of time. Most people aren't. Mm-hmm. So I guess, what I'm trying to say is like, don't let the fact that maybe you've made a bad decision in the past or a bad judgment call in placing a tenant in a property get you out of the game.
Right.
It's not worth it. Like it's too real. There's such a cool opportunity here that like you got to keep trying to call it a lesson learned, an expensive education, move on, get someone better in, or hire a professional property manager who has a good track record of placing tenants.
Yeah.
Who ideally has some skin in the game too, and is going to help you through that.
Yeah. Chris, and you alluded to this before. Even with the best screening, even with doing as much as you can to ensure you're getting the best quality tenant, things will happen. A bad one will slip through the cracks.
Absolutely, it's going to happen. We have some good stories for you today, by the way.
Don't we? Let me tell you. But to Chris's bigger point, don't let that discourage you. And to the bigger point, I think beyond that is if you have placed that bad tenant in there, re-examine what you're doing going forward because, hey, it didn't work the first time. It's not going to work the next. You need to be more stringent, or you need to hire a professional that actually can do what needs to be done in terms of background screening on that tenant.
Yeah, and all of these topics that we're going through, these 11 kind of major functions of what managing a property is, we talked before about marketing your property for the masses and the numbers that you have to have. And that's part of what Jesse's talking about here is like, you've got to be selective. Don't get desperate. If you haven't done a good enough job on the marketing the property or figuring out the right price point or that kind of thing, you're gonna feel like you're in this place of desperation where you just have to take the next person that walks through the door. That's a bad place to be. More often than not, you're going to regret that decision, and it's going to cost you way more money than you think it's saving you by having the property filled a month sooner or a week sooner or whatever.
Absolutely, and you need to think about that and plan accordingly because it definitely can and will happen.
Speaking of which, Jesse, you got any fun stories around that?
Where do I begin? Actually, it's interesting. So I've been both a landlord, property owner myself, and a tenant, of course. My nightmare story comes from when I was living back in Pennsylvania. I had a condo. I didn't own the condo. I was living in a condo, and the owner had another room that she wanted to rent out. She wanted to maximize profits, of course, understandable. So she wanted to bring in a second roommate into this condo where I was living. Technically, it was a 3-bedroom condo, so pretty good sized space, or so I thought. Well, she again was self-managing, and she relied on an ad in the newspaper. That's how long ago this was. I'm kind of dating myself.
Yeah, wow.
Early 2000s.
What's a newspaper?
Yeah, right. People still put stuff in the newspaper back then. But yeah, she placed an ad in the newspaper. Well, lo and behold, someone had responded. And this gentleman shows up. Well, let me back that up. He proceeds to have a conversation with my landlord, the property owner, sells himself as one thing. He shows up being 15 years older than he actually was, and he still lied about his age. I mean, I don't know why and how you lie about your age, but...
Yeah, it can happen.
But he did. Well, this person had a substance abuse problem that he was hiding from everybody, including his own family. He had his family actually on board trying to get him to live with me. Now I know why, for obvious reasons, because they didn't want to live with him either.
Yeah, no kidding. And Jesse's squeaky clean, by the way.
Like
about
nerdy,
about as
boring.
squeaky clean as they come.
Yeah, like ridiculous. Like I stop at lights at 2 something in the morning, like when no one else does. You know? Those tags that say "Don't cut off your couch," I don't. Because it tells me not to. So yes. But beyond that, I'm squeaky clean in terms of how I live as well. So like everything, my bed's made constantly. So I'm now living with a substance abuse person who has an issue, and as if all this wasn't enough, a very large Rottweiler was introduced into the mix.
Wow. Was that on the application, you think?
No,
Yeah,
that was
probably
not on
not.
the application. That dog kind of just showed up under false pretenses that he was fostering. Here, I'll do the air quotes like you were doing before. Well, that wasn't a foster situation. That was an actual, that dog was living with me. And, this gentleman being passed out from, prescription drugs and alcohol, he'd be sleeping till 1, 2 in the afternoon. I'd come home from work. The dog needs to be taken out. I'm a humane person, so of course I'm going to take this dog out. This was all over a span of probably 3 weeks, but it felt like an eternity. The moral of the story, the point of all this is my landlord, she had the best of intentions. She, to her credit, worked with me before she tried to bring someone in, but she didn't have the proper screening in place. Obviously,
Yep.
she trusted people too much. Trust but verify is one of my favorite sayings. Well, she didn't verify anything. And as such, I was living with someone who was, I think he was 15 years older than I was at the time and had a lot of issues. Don't let that happen to you as a property owner. And my gosh, don't do that to any of your tenants.
Well, and I just go back to, there are lots of, and I don't want this to sound like bashing because I'm certainly not, because I've been there and done that. But here's what I learned. There are lots of programs and things online that you can get that will help you screen the tenant. And that's great. That's certainly better than not doing anything. But I guess what I'm trying to say is the program, the data, it's easy to get the data. Mm-hmm. What's difficult is knowing what to look for in the data. Now, for most applications, not a big deal, but believe it or not, folks, there are people out there that are being dishonest intentionally to try to get into your property. And guess what? They're primarily trying to target DIY landlords because they know that folks don't have the training to know the red flags to look for. They haven't seen the volume of applications. And so when people are looking for people who are committing fraud, they're going to try to go toward where they think the fraud is easiest to commit. Now, where is the fraud easiest to commit? Johnny landlord who, has one property and screens a tenant maybe once every few years, or a big property management company that screens, hundreds, if not thousands of tenants a year, and they know what to look for. It's going to happen. So we got a couple stories about that, about just ways that you could really be caught surprised.
I was going to ask Chris, you have some stories.
I have some stories. That's true.
Could be the rest of the podcast. Probably.
It could be. I don't want to scare people off, but the whole idea is like, look, if I've got a toothache, I'm not going to try to take care of that myself. I'm going to go to the dentist. Why? Could I maybe take care of it myself? Eventually, I could probably figure out how to do it. Can't be that hard. Should I? I'm probably going to cause more damage than necessary than just going to the dentist and getting the professional to take care of it. They know what to look for.
Right.
Same thing with anything else. So it's like, can you do your own taxes? Yeah, sure, if they're simple. But what if there's a lot on the line, or you've got kind of a more complicated situation? You bring in a professional, and that's all they do.
Free piece of tax advice: if you relocate from one state to another in 1 year, don't do it on your own. It seems easy, it seems straightforward, but my gosh, it's just not. Oh, and if you throw in a job change with that, good luck.
Yeah, exactly. So a couple stories of some reasons why it's important to be selective with your tenant. I had a gentleman tell me one time, so this was not a property that we managed, but he's like, I will never, this is one of those sad stories where it's like, I'll never rent a property again. This is my house, and the tenants moved out, and they had destroyed the microwave, destroyed a bunch of things. But the thing that stood out in the story to me was somehow the tenants had managed to put holes through the granite countertops.
That takes effort.
That takes a lot of effort. I don't know how you even do that. I think like they put like they had, I don't know, it was like the owner said they thought it was like something hot or something, like, I don't know what they did, but somehow they got holes through the granite countertops. I'm just like, that's trying, man. Like that's tough to do. And so, I've got another one where I think I made mention in one of the last episodes about just being too eager to get someone in a property. We one time, oh man, red flag I should have looked out for. So got the tenant, screened them. They looked pretty good. Didn't use tight enough criteria. There are several types of criteria you can use, which we'll get into later. And sure enough, like month 3 or 4, she started having trouble paying rent. And what I should have been aware of, and everyone listening is going to be like, well, yeah, you idiot. Yeah, no, I'm going to tell you what the red flag was. And you go, oh yeah, it's a red flag. But I'll tell you what, most people when put in that situation, if you haven't done this a lot and you don't have that experience yourself, you'd probably make the same decision. And what it was is we said, hey, you need to come up with a security deposit and we're going to sign the lease or whatever at the unit. And she's all excited. Nice woman, older single woman, like super excited to help her out. Really sweet lady. And we get there, and I had been having a heck of a time filling this property for one reason or another. People it was really nice, it was clean, but people didn't like the layout. And so we had to drop the rent like a couple $100, and I just bought it. And so I was like, man, this already isn't meeting my financial expectations, So I'm like desperate to get someone in there. So meet this lady out there. She's ready to move in like a week. I'm like, okay, and you have the money for the security deposit? And she goes, yeah, here you go. And she gives me the check. I'm like, this is only 3/4 of the security deposit. And she's like, well, I know, I'll get you the rest tomorrow. What I should have done was give her the check back and say, I'm really sorry, but this isn't going to work out. What I actually did was say, okay.
Because Chris is a nice guy.
Because if you operate off of being a nice person and not as a business,
Exactly.
right, then you're going to end up putting yourself in these situations. And that's a huge red flag. Anytime someone doesn't have the funds or they say, hey, let me get it to you, in a few more days or whatever, it's like, yeah, no. Anyway, that one didn't work out so well. Another one was I had another property, same situation, had showed many people for one reason or another. They just didn't care for it. Finally got someone in. She was super excited about it, but there was just something odd. Like she was overly eager to get into the property to where it was like borderline rude or inappropriate. Like when we showed it with multiple people in there. And she had someone else who was kind of being a guarantor for her and like paying the rent and whatnot. Anyway, also made some mistakes there where I didn't put the guarantor on the lease. I just put this woman on the lease. Again, this was back before we did property management professionally for other people and when I was doing it on my own. So she's doing pretty well for a while, but then I think she lost her job and all of a sudden went down this spiral. And she started having all of these visitors, air quotes, over, who were doing who knows what. But I'm fairly certain it wasn't legal, whatever was going on there. And she wasn't causing a big problem, but we kept getting these notices of people speeding through the parking lot mailed to us. And finally, like it was like $100 per violation, and was like, hey, your guest over in this building basically was speeding through the parking lot, so here's $100 violation. And then like 3 days later, I'd go to the mailbox and like, here's another $100 violation.
Whoa.
Within a week or two, we're up to like $500 or $600 from the HOA. And I'm like, this has got to stop,
Wow.
And it was just one of those situations where, the woman had lost her job and she was living on auntie's money. She had kids of her own. And unfortunately, she started kind of getting wrapped up, I think, just in the wrong crowd and doing the wrong things and having not great people over. And then she, how she was taking care of the unit, she became this completely different person from who I met at the property. And there were a lot of red flags in that scenario had I paid attention, and had I screened that a little better and structured how the lease was going to be set up, I think we would have been in a much, much better situation. But I ended up having to have, that's a difficult conversation where I went over there and I was like, hey, look, you've got to go. And she basically started crying in front of her 2 or 3 little girls and was like, so you're telling me you're going to put me out on the street? I have nowhere to go. And I said, I'm really sorry, but yeah, you got to go.
But like
we
Chris,
can't have this.
You said, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, I don't want to put you out on the street, but I didn't. You did.
Yeah.
And I can't have you stealing money out of my pocket
Right.
because of your irresponsible behavior, just because I feel badly about the situation. I do feel badly. I wish you the best of luck. I feel awful that this is what it's come to, but that's not my issue. And if you're not comfortable having that conversation, don't manage your own properties.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Because it's heartbreaking, that's heartbreaking to do that in front of those kids. And oh man.
And that's what I was going to say. You can be compassionate, as we said before. We both want to be nice guys, but it is a business and you have to treat it as such. And a business decision in a situation like that, yeah, she's got to go, as hard as that is to have that conversation.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And, I think like what we've talked about before when you're marketing your property is before you get to the stage where you're like physically screening people out, there are things that you should be thinking about or doing that's part of your screening process that isn't actually what you kind of consider the background checker in the screening portion. One is, remember, like attracts like. So if you want a high quality tenant, have a high quality property that shows well. If you've got dingy carpets, if you've got dingy carpets, and like we were having this conversation with a client, Jesse and I, just a little while back, it's like, hey, you can replace the carpets and likely get more in rent, but more importantly, we think a better quality tenant. Mm-hmm. If you don't, that tenant who is really nitpicky and they're a clean freak and they're anal retentive, guess what? They're moving on. They're not renting that property. The ones that really don't care and they're like, maybe my mess will kind of go unnoticed here, they're going to be the ones that are interested.
Yeah, and is that really the kind of tenant you want?
And is that what you want? Right. So that's the first thing. Remember, like attracts like. Mm-hmm. That's your first way to screen people. Right. Super duper important. People forget that. Oh, I'll just show the property like crap and then I'll catch them on the application whether they're good or bad. Nope, doesn't work that way. Mm. Second is have some sort of financial screening in place. And the way you do that, I think, is you have a little bit higher barrier to entry with finances. So the way we do that is we say, hey, just to reserve the property and take it off the market, you've got to come up with a full month's rent plus at least a full month's security deposit, more if your credit's not super stellar. And there aren't a ton of people out there that can just come up with 2 months rent and not move in for a month because they still have their security deposit tied up at the other place, et cetera. So there have been several times where we've had really great looking applicants. And they're like, you want me to come up with how much money? And we're like, it's 2 months rent. And they said, well, is that flexible? Nope. Okay, then I guess we can't do it. And it's like, whew, dodge that bullet, because what you want to do is you want to make sure people have enough buffer so that when something happens, like, I don't know, coronavirus, someone loses a job, they've got a little bit of liquidity. Hopefully they can continue to pay you. Even that's not perfect.
Right.
We've got a situation right now where we do that. People look great rental history, great credit. And sure enough, we're like a month and a half in and $250 payment and check bounced. And it's like, oh my word. You just had a balance due, a prorated rent amount of $250 and your check bounced. This isn't good. We got to have a conversation. So those are the two things I think right out the gate you should be doing to screen people. But then there are other things that need to come into play as far as your physical, like your actual screening criteria. And for that, what I would highly recommend folks have is you need to have predetermined screening criteria. Mm-hmm. And as long as they're legal and within the law, they can be whatever you feel like they need to be. As long as they're within the law. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're not legal experts, but we're pretty good when it comes to fair housing and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so have a scorecard, like have a process where before you ever take the first application, you're going to say, hey, I will accept a credit score of this amount. I will accept collections of this. Will you or will you not accept bankruptcies? How far back? Will you or will you not accept violent crimes? What about DWIs or DUIs? What about assault? What about like all these different things? What is your stance going to be? How many times can they pay late to their prior landlord? What kind of dogs or pets can they have and breeds? How heavy can they be? How many can you have? How many people per room are you going to allow? How many people per room do you have to allow per fair housing standards? What is their income to rent ratio going to be? Are you going to do an employment and verification and a check? Like all these things you need to have determined. You go, oh my gosh, that's way too formal and overkill, Chris. I'm just this landlord trying to rent out their property. Well, okay. maybe you get away with it, but one, I'll ask you, is that truly fair to people applying? Two, how much liability are you exposing yourself to for a potential lawsuit if you don't do those things?
Yeah, having that framework is going to be so beneficial to you. And it's really essential if you want to set yourself up for success.
Yeah.
And if not, pay someone to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think ultimately the most fair thing is, you give the tenant that application criteria ahead of time. You say, hey, I would love for you to apply. Please take a minute to read through this and make sure you're comfortable applying. And if not, that's okay. But I want to be transparent with you. And quite frankly, in some states, they crack down on it even more. We're just talking about it kind of from like a federal level and a North Carolina level, but there are a lot of states out there that are even more strict than kind of the federal rules. So have that written down. Make sure you're disclosing that to people ahead of time. And guess what? People are still going to apply. We get people all the time. I have excellent credit. And then they apply and it's like 480. What? How is that?
That's not out of 500.
Oh,
right?
well, that's my deadbeat boyfriend,
Yeah. That happens though.
It does happen all the time. Yeah, I do pay my bills on time, except my student loans. You didn't ask me about my student loans. Well, okay,
The thought process, I swear.
But anyway, all right. So with that, go ahead.
I was just gonna say the whole idea here, of course, in terms of screening, is how we're gonna be marketing the property and who we're trying to bring in. And we've talked about this in greater detail in another episode, so I'll touch upon this. But basically, when you are marketing, when you're advertising your home, we want you to stay on the right side of the law.
Absolutely.
Because there are laws out there to protect a lot of different individuals in specifically, and again, we talked about this before, there are 7 protected classes. I'll get into this in just a moment. A couple things in terms of marketing your property that are really easy just to think about. When you're marketing the property, you're advertising the home. You're always talking about the property itself. You don't want to think about, describe the property, describe the home, describe the condo, whatever the case, but you don't want to go ahead, and I think we've even talked about this example before. There's a park across the street, and you think to yourself, hey, great park for kids, or this house is great for families. That might be true. And I mean, in your mind and in your heart, you have the best of intentions, but guess what? You are now marketing and you are in violation of federal fair housing laws.
Yep.
Because
big no-no.
Yeah, it's a big no-no. That's one of the 7 protected classes, familial status. So, okay, great. Your house is good for a family with small children. What about a couple? Can a couple not live there?
Right.
And
what about a single person who has roommates?
There you go.
Or a widow or a widower.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So in your mind, and again, that park, you make a valid point, but indirectly what ends up happening is you are in violation of federal fair housing laws because you have done that.
Anytime you're going to show a preference for or not for a person or a class of people, because let's be honest, everyone out there is part of a protected class.
Absolutely.
It's just like, familial status. So like, okay, there's single, there's people with kids, people without kids, people who are married, people who are not married, people who are dating each other, whatever. And so everyone literally falls into that bucket. And so you can't use that way to segregate people to make a decision on whether or not, or even show preference on who you rent your home to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And as mentioned, there are 7 of them. We're obviously talking about familial status here in great detail, but race, religion, sex, color, national origin, and disability are the others. You cannot you cannot discriminate against any of those protected classes, and you have to be very, very careful with how you're marketing and advertising your property.
And I would say the one that I see a lot is familial status, to tell you the truth. In fact, I was just talking to some folks the other day, great people, had the best of intentions, are like, well, and this makes total logical sense, right? I would really prefer to rent my house to someone, these were folks doing it on their own. I really want to rent my house to someone it's a 2-income household, especially in the current environment. Like, I just think that's going to be a lot more stable. Don't do it. I know it's so tempting. I know logically it makes sense, but that is totally a violation of fair housing. You can't do it. And so you just, like, again, common sense, it's thrown out the window when it comes to fair housing. And I don't mean that disrespectfully or rude or anything, but you really do. You can't rely on being smart. You can't rely on having common sense when it comes to these things around fair housing. You just have to know the law.
Absolutely. And if you don't know the law, consult with someone who does.
Yes.
Or hire a property manager.
Not someone who proclaims they know the law.
That's right.
But someone who actually knows the law.
Yeah, it's not someone looks something up on Wikipedia or Google search. No, it doesn't work.
Yep, exactly. And do know too, like Jesse said, there are oftentimes certain states or municipalities may have additional requirements or additional protected classes.
That's exactly right.
I was doing some reading. I believe we talked before how age at a federal level, age is not a protected class, but you want to be really thoughtful about whether or not that's truly something you want to discriminate against. We don't. But like in New York, I think I was reading that age is like a protected class in New York. So every place is going to be a little bit different, but this is kind of the minimum requirement from the federal level.
One other thing we always want to look out for, or you always want to look out for when you're advertising your property, something that might have a disparate impact on a class. And the example we give, a criminal record. Someone can have a criminal record, and I even wrote this down. Not all bad guys are good, and not all good guys are bad. So a criminal record does not automatically disqualify someone from being a well-qualified tenant. It's going to depend, of course, on what is involved with that criminal record. A white-collar crime, a simple misdemeanor an indiscretion of a 15-year-old that kind of carried over. I mean, yeah, those are things that happen in life. That's very different from a violent criminal offender. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because someone has a criminal record that they can't qualify to be a tenant.
Well, let's go back to why this is an issue. So the intention is good, right? I don't want a bunch of thugs,
of course,
regardless of what picture in your mind you just painted when I said that. But like, I don't want a bunch of criminals living in my property and putting other folks at risk. And quite frankly, I may not be comfortable going over to the property if I know that person is a criminal. Totally fair. Makes total sense. I get it. Okay, so what some people would think would be a logical conclusion to make is I will just say in my application criteria, if you have a criminal record, you won't be allowed to rent this property or something to that effect. Now, what HUD did is they came back and they said, whoa, wait a second. If we can show that any criteria a landlord establishes has what's called a disparate impact, or basically adversely impacts a specific protected class, that is illegal. So what they did is they went back and they did a study and they said, hey, in this area, I think this was like a case that got brought in front of HUD or something is how this happened. And basically some folks were arguing like, hey, having this requirement has a disparate impact on minorities. And what they found was that minorities, or at least in this particular area or region of the United States, minorities were more likely to have a criminal record than Caucasians. And so they basically said, by having this blanket statement that says you can't have a criminal record to rent here, you're basically saying you are going to disqualify minorities more often, or people of color, than you are Caucasians. Therefore, you cannot have this blanket policy. Now, what's really tough about this, I think, is it makes it really hard. I mean, right now, to my knowledge, this hasn't been fought on credit or other things, but I think you could take this argument of disparate impact and apply it to almost any other screening criteria, which makes this really tough to actually implement.
Yeah.
But this is one that's actually like been a case in the past that you have to be really careful of. So I think what's tricky about this, and Chris Loebsack's going to talk about this later, is I think this is only going to become more difficult to navigate in the future. It's not going to be easier. See what happened with like the CDC's, emergency directive, and a lot of the ways the government is getting involved, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think the facts are this is going to become a much more litigious, difficult to navigate, like murky area than it has been in the past. Things are not going to get simpler over time. So just know that virtually anything that you put out there, you've got to just be really, really, really careful.
Comes back to what you said before, Chris. It seems like common sense to just say anyone with a criminal record should not qualify, but for all the reasons we just described, you can't say that.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Cool.
Now, another thing that you cannot discriminate against, service animals.
Yes.
Now, it's okay as a property owner or a landlord to say, hey, I don't want pets in my home. That's fine. That's your discretion. You might be cutting your rental pool in half.
Yeah.
And that's totally fine.
In some places like California, like I go to San Diego, I think everyone owns a dog in San Diego. So it might be even, 80%.
Literally everyone?
Well, I don't know. You tell me, man. But I tell you what, when I've walked the streets of San Diego, it's like, wow, everyone is walking with a dog.
There you go.
There are some very pet-friendly areas. Charlotte, we say it's give or take half of the rental pool, right?
Right. And that's an entirely separate subject, but
Sure.
it's up to you whether or not you decide, hey, I do want to allow pets or I don't. So that's perfectly fine. But what is not okay to say is service animals are also not allowed. You cannot, as a landlord, property owner, property manager, say service animals are not allowed on my property. Chris and I talked a little bit about this before. I think the only way is what if it's the owner can prove it is
It's an adverse
impact. There it is.
That's pretty tough to prove too, because you basically have to show as an owner that there is a high degree of certainty. I'm not going to use the words right, so go look this up, ask your attorney. But there's a high degree. Essentially, what you're trying to prove as an owner is there's a high degree of certainty I'm going to suffer a significant financial loss if we allow this animal in. And that is pretty tough to prove.
Yeah.
I even went back for one. We had one who applied with a German Shepherd and their emotional support animal. Well, guess what? I was like, well, geez, I think, German Shepherd could be a high risk. Most insurance policies don't allow a German Shepherd. So what happens if the insurance policy gets canceled? Well, found out it's illegal for insurance companies now to cancel a policy due to a service animal. Mm-hmm. Because it's not a pet or a regular old animal. So even that's hard to prove. So I guess what I'm saying is if someone applies with a service animal and they show you all the appropriate proof, you better not use that as your decision criteria on whether or not you rented them.
Absolutely. And that can be a lot easier if it's an emotional support rabbit. Oh, hey, cute, small, fun. But if it's an emotional support miniature pony, I mean, that's an entirely different situation.
Yeah, but they're like emotional support chickens.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
snakes,
raccoons,
spiders.
you name it, everything.
Yeah, you name it.
It's
out there.
It is a thing now.
So just be really careful about that and make sure you're following the letter of the law. Get if you're at all have any questions there, make sure you're reaching out to an attorney or use a professional property management company.
None of this is to scare you. It's more so just to warn you and just things to look out for and to be careful of.
Yeah. And you might be doing this. You may have been doing this for 5-10 years and you've never ran across that, and that's fine.
Hopefully you never do.
Yeah, hopefully, or if you do. And again, hey, service animals, emotional support animals, great thing. It's just they're very hot button topics. So you have to be careful you handle them appropriately. And just know that like it's one of those few things. All these are things that hopefully don't happen very often. But like we've said before, cumulatively, when you add them all together, chances are you doing this long enough, you're going to run into one of them.
Yeah.
So we just want you to be prepared when you do. Awesome. All right, so we talked a little bit about the pre-qualification with like attracts like and all that. Also, what you should be doing is just letting folks know before they even go to see the property. Hey, here's our qualification criteria. You tell me, what are your answers to these questions? Is your credit score at least X? Do you have any felonies you think we should be aware of? Like what you're trying to do is get them to self-select out so they don't waste your time.
Right. And you're also being fully transparent in terms of how we are screening our tenants. So you're setting the table before they're even coming down.
Yeah. The other thing too is, if you can get them on the phone communicating, remember you're going to be kind of married to this person, so to speak, for the next year, a couple of years, whatever. So they better be polite and professional and courteous. If they're a jerk, when like during what should be the dating phase, it's only going to go downhill from there.
Yeah.
So that's another area where I think it's important. Our team knows like, hey, if someone is answering the phone on a leasing call and that person is rude or disrespectful right away for no good reason, then they submit an application, guess what? There's a note that goes in the file where the leasing team's like, hey, this, go back and listen to this call. It was really inappropriate. And you can use that as a decision. Like, hey, I'm not going to rent to, someone who's disrespectful or swears at me on the phone or whatever. You just better be prepared to like back up that you didn't do that in some sort of, biased way on any one of those protected classes.
There was no malice aforethought, basically.
Yes, exactly. All right. So what are we going to use to screen and how we would do that? So you want to take a look at verify all their info. So like we have on here, like you want any sort of personal references or emergency contacts. Where that becomes helpful is potentially down the road if they skip out or when they do become a tenant, if something should happen and you happen to say discover them incapacitated or something else, you need to know who to call. But also if they happen to skip rent or do something else, you have some friends of theirs, hopefully, that you can call as well. Make sure you do get a photo ID verification. Ideally, it's a government issued ID. I'm going to give you a really awesome fraud story here in a minute. Well, only awesome because it ended well. Spoiler alert. Get some rental references. So we recommend going back to, don't just go to the last one or the current rental reference. Because guess what? If they're a bad tenant, what's the current rental reference going to say? Oh yeah, they're great. You should rent to them right away. In fact, they're so awesome. I am voluntarily ending their lease early with no penalty. They've just been amazing tenants. You should take them.
Yeah.
They also might be fearful of retaliation from the tenant, right? So take the current rental reference with a grain of salt, but I still recommend you going out there and asking them because they still might. We've done that before too, and I see this argued all the time on property management forums that I'm a part of. Like there are a lot of property management companies out there that say, "Hey, I think it's a complete waste of time to get rental references. You can see everything you need to in the credit and payment history and whatnot." Well, sometimes, but what about? There have been multiple times where we've denied someone because of bad rental reference. We've had it to where, late rent payments don't show up on their credit history. So the landlord, you don't know until you go talk to the landlord and find that out. Or they might look really great on credit, but maybe they don't care about paying their rent on time. They pay all their other bills on time, but they think rent is last priority because it doesn't get reported to the credit agencies. We, by the way, do. So if you're interested in talking about that with us, we're now starting to report good and bad credit, which is really cool. Something we're excited about because we actually get to help people build credit to buy a home or car or whatever. But also we have a little bit more teeth now when someone doesn't pay their bill on time.
Right.
Anyway, I digress. So, but the other thing is like sometimes people will tell you very interesting things. Like we had someone one time looked really great on paper. We were about to sign a lease with them, called the current landlord, and they're like, "Oh yeah, well, I mean, they're pretty good tenants." We said, "Well, what can you tell me?" "Well, they're slobs." "What do you mean by that?" "Well, let me tell you about the time I went in there and blah, 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 blah. And every time I go in there, it looks like this." And it's like, "Oh, okay."
That's how we describe pretty good tenants.
Not appropriate. So we're not going to rent to them. And then you have to tell the tenant. But there are definitely times where we deny people because of bad rental references. So definitely make sure you know the laws, though, what you can and can't ask. That's also a good opportunity to ask, by the way, when you rented to this tenant, how many occupants were in there and what were their names? Did they have any pets by chance? Oh, wow. They had 2 Rottweilers. They don't have any pets on their application with us, or they said that they were labs. Then you got to go back and ask the tenant, and so it's a good way to triangulate information. Ultimately treat everyone with the utmost respect, but you kind of got to be a private investigator where you're looking for fraud on every single application. And if you're not willing or able to do that, again, that's the part that can be kind of draining and where you can miss those red flags. Obviously, you're going to want to check their credit. I'm not going to tell you what credit score is right for you, but do some research there and where you feel comfortable. Oftentimes, we recommend doing some sort of range where you might say, hey, a preferred credit score is here, and that gets you 1 month security deposit or something like that. And then it can go down to this lower limit. That's, North Carolina, the most you can charge is 2 months security deposit. So you might want to consider something like that, or you can do something different, but just make sure you're within the law. And of course, in addition to credit, you got to think about like, hey, are you going to allow anyone who has collections or charge-offs? Well, what if it's medical debt? Should that be treated differently than regular debt? Because sometimes we know how easy it is to go to collection for medical debt. We almost went to collections. Like we have an awesome credit score, and we were like days away from going to collections one time for a $25 bill that we didn't even know we had. They'd never even sent us. And it was only because we called in about another bill that they told my wife, oh, by the way, you owe us $27 or something. She's like, for what? And they're like, well, we sent this bill. And she's like, no way. My wife is the most organized person I know. It's like, if we didn't get the bill, I know we didn't get the bill. And so just be aware of that. Like for us, we make an exception for medical debt. We don't for student loans, though. So if you don't pay your student loans on time, but that's a call. You got to just determine what it is and treat everyone the same. Mm-hmm. Also, what about charge-offs? What about bankruptcies? What What about foreclosures? What about if they have a solid credit score and everything was good, but they have late payments on a mortgage? What about if they owe money to a property management company that's past due, but it's not delinquent? Like, what is your decision criteria going to be around that? So you got to think about all those things. And then criminal record, like Jesse said. So be thoughtful about like what criminal history are you comfortable placing someone with, and then you got to develop policies around that, and then you just have to treat everyone fair and consistently.
Yep.
And again, I think the struggle here is technically there's a lot of opportunity here for disparate impact too. And it's hard because you're kind of like, I got to do what I feel like is the right thing for both the community and myself and what I feel is safe and who I'm comfortable renting to, but I also have to do the right thing to stay on the right side of the law. So when in doubt, consult an attorney. And then of course, income and employment, you got to come up with like, hey, how many times rent should income be? Make sure that you're verifying that income. Call the employer, get the pay stubs, verify that it's currently employed. Make sure the pay stubs you've got a couple of them and that they're recent, and that they're not fraudulent. Believe it or not, some people will come up with fraudulent pay stubs. Also, if they're moving to the area from out of state, don't take pay stubs from their current state or their current area. Ask them, hey, you're moving here. That's great. Congratulations. I see you currently work in Wyoming and you're moving to North Carolina. Can you tell me, have you gotten a job in North Carolina yet? And then they might say, oh, well, no, I'm going to look when I get there. Oh, so the pay stubs you got aren't really income. So as soon as you get here, you're unemployed. Different conversation. Or they might say something like, well, I've got a job lined up. Okay, great. Can you show me an signed offer letter that I can verify? And then they might say yes or no. Or they might say, well, yeah, I'm just going to work virtually or remotely. Okay, sounds great. So when I call your employer at ABC Company in Wyoming and I ask them if you have permission to work virtually from Charlotte, they're going to tell me yes? Well, so, those are the things you'd like. I don't think I did those things when I was doing it myself.
I would say any qualified tenant, if someone comes back and says, hey, you know what? Yeah, happy to produce any of this information you're asking for, Mr. Landlord, Mr. Property Manager. Great. You've got, you're off on the right track. But if someone's kind of pushing back and saying, boy, do you really need all that information? Well, why would you have a hard time providing this information? We're potentially giving you a place to live, which is someone else's house. So there should be no issue and no pushback.
They want to get this done and over with. I mean, anyone who's gone through this process, It's like, we try to make it effortless, but they're like, oh yeah, sure, whatever you need to just get the process done.
Right. That's a red flag to me. Anytime someone's like, well, do you really need this? Do you really? Yes.
Or if they're really disorganized, or like what we find is the tenants who are like, oh, absolutely, here it is, boom, and they get it to you right away. You're like, wow, you're going to probably be a pretty good tenant.
Yeah.
Except I will say that could this is a hard part. You're going to you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, Chris, because that could be a super red flag if they have it super duper available, or it could be a good sign. So let me tell you a story about this. This was one where we caught this, but holy cow. So this woman applied for a property like a year and a half ago. And I'm trying to remember the whole story. So she put in this application, looked great, good credit, solid income, rental references on there, everything. There was one instance on her criminal record where it said that she had written a simple worthless check. May or may not get denied for that. I mean, depending on what your criteria is. There was one other thing that didn't quite feel right. Now, I don't know what it was. So we went into investigator mode. Now, on the surface, most people looking at this application would have been like, boom, slam dunk, absolutely. Solid credit, etc. Well, what we did was this is how we caught her. We went to the rental reference. She gave a rental reference for 123 Main Street. Here's the phone number and everything, right? So what do? We call that phone number. And she's like, the person who answers is like, yeah, D's something property management. And we're like, okay, well, hey, we're doing a tenant verification for this person. Have a couple questions to ask you. Oh yeah, great tenant, paid on time, et cetera, et cetera. What questions do you have? Told them what questions we had. And then, oh yeah, it's all great. And then we said, I don't know. So then what we did is we went and we took that property and we looked at the tax records of who the owner was for that property. Turns out the owner of that property was a local, it's like American Homes for Rent or one of those big properties where they manage their own properties. So what we did was we called American Homes for Rent instead of the number that this person gave us. And we said, hey, we have a rental verification to do for this time period. Who was living at that property? Was it this person? They said, nope, no record of that person ever being here. So then we call this mysterious property management company back up, and we're like, hey, so funny thing happened. This property belongs to someone else. And they do their own property management. They don't have a property management company that works for them because they manage their own. I'm confused. And then she went off into this rant. Oh, well, this is why, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, just real quick, you said you managed property for the owner, right? Oh, yeah. I said, great. What's your North Carolina real estate license number? Well, I don't have to have. Yes, you do. You do have to have one in North Carolina. You have to be licensed with the state. Oh, well, I don't have one of those. Oh, so I should call the North Carolina Real Estate Commission then? And then like you could tell like she was just freezing. And so that's how we caught her. And what had happened, this was a really frustrating part. What we found out was she had stolen someone's identity. So she had the person's social security number, name, birth date, license, and passport. And she submitted all that. And she was so eager when I asked for a second form of identification, because I said, this is what kind of was difficult about this, was we suspected potentially it was identity theft. And we said, hey, can we have a second form of identification? And within seconds, she emailed us this scanned passport. And we just thought, either you are really, really organized. Like my wife would have been able to do that, but not very many people are like, hey, let me just pull out my scanned copy of my passport. I know exactly where it is. Here to go. Most people are like, I have it handy because I think you're going to ask for it because I'm lying. Like if she was really good, she'd been like, yeah, let me see if I can find my passport and then wait a few hours, you know? So that was like kind of also suspicious. But what we ended up doing was we called the police and we said, hey, this person has had their identity stolen. They tried to apply for one of our properties. You know what the police told us? Did you suffer a loss? Well, luckily, no. Sorry, can't do anything about it. And I was like, so you're telling me if I witness a robbery happening in front of my eyes, even though it's not to my property, I shouldn't call you?
Wow.
And they're like, sorry, can't do anything about it. Good luck. If you can get a hold of the person whose identity got stolen, and they could submit a police report, but you can't. And I just went, you gotta be kidding me.
So you're doing their work for them almost.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, come on, man. Like, I'm like handing you over this, like, you know, anyway. Wow. But I guess what I'm saying is like, can you imagine if that woman would have rented that place? What a nightmare that would have been, and trying to get her out, and it would have just been a mess. But luckily we caught that. And I'll tell you right now, I would not have caught that as a DIY landlord. Wouldn't have caught it.
Yeah.
It's only because we see so many of these things that you kind of go, something smells funny.
Yeah, something's not
right. And
right
you start digging and digging and digging, and you know what tools to use. Like how many Joe Schmoes out there are going to be like, oh yeah, I know where to look up the tax records, and I know that this company uses professional property management, but that company doesn't. And it's not like, you know, I'm sure that at some point we're going to be a victim of fraud and we're going to miss one, but hopefully not. And so you really got to know those red flags to look for. So that's my crazy, scary fraud story.
That is pretty crazy to think that someone, and to your point, they went so far with the lie, but there were just so many little subtle things that they didn't go far enough. I mean, like what I'm not promoting lying here. I'm basically saying like, how do you think you're going to get away with that in the long term?
Because she even had pay stubs, right, of this company. So what I did was we Googled the company and we did Street View, and it's like this old rundown building. And the number on Google for the company didn't match the number that she put on her application.
Wow.
So this is pretty common, folks. Like be thoughtful about when you're calling a rental reference or an employment reference. Come up with a question ahead of time that you can ask them that only they would know. So for example, if it's a rental reference, right? They could very easily, it'd be easy for me to say, hey, here's my rental reference. And I give you Jesse's phone number because I was a really bad tenant. And I said, I lived at 123 Main Street. My landlord was Jesse Mancuso. His number is 555-1234. You should give him a call. And then Jesse answers the phone And you're like, hey, yeah, I'm doing a rental reference for Chris Claflin. Was he a tenant of yours? Oh yeah, loved him. Great guy. You should totally rent to him. Okay, here's something that you could ask him. Hey, what is? Oh, and what's your name again? And then he's gonna say, well, my name's, and he could even pretend to be Johnny Landlord. My name's Johnny Landlord. Okay, great. Hey, Johnny. I'm not saying this case, but sometimes what we experience is fraud in these rental references. And I'm sure this isn't it, but could you just do me a couple quick favors? Could you please verify the address that your property tax bill gets sent to each year? Oh, you can't? Okay. Can you tell me what your wife's name is on the deed, please? Oh, you can't? Okay. Well, how about this? Tell you what, can you just sign a piece of paper, take a picture of it, and send it back to me? And then you as the owner can compare that signature to what shows up on the deed that's recorded that you should be able to find online. Those are ways that you could potentially try to catch someone in a scam. Or if it's an employer, you could ask them the social security number of the employee to confirm it, or to confirm the exact dollar amount, or to confirm the last pay stub or something of that nature. So come up with some piece of information that you can ask them if you're suspicious that this might be something. Try to catch them in the lie. And then if you're just not sure, just tell the person, hey, sorry, you're denied. And, we couldn't verify your rental reference, which is true.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it. Couldn't verify your rental reference.
At that point.
Yeah.
All the more reason to make sure you have, like Chris said earlier, a framework set up for all of this and to understand the things to look out for. Because like you said, how many do-it-yourself landlords would think about a lot of those things? You're just going to pick up that phone, call XYZ management company. Oh yeah, Joe Schmo was great as a tenant. You're going to take that at face value and potentially move forward, and you might have a problem on your hands.
Only the people who have listened to this podcast are going to do that, or who have been burned at least once. And if you've been burned, you've probably been burned to the tune of several $1,000s, is my guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway. All right. Enough about that. So verify income and employment. Watch out for those red flags. I think we kind of talked about that. A huge sense of urgency. A lot of folks that are desperate for a reason. Not always, but desperate for a reason. They might also tell you things that sound really cool to you, and that's why they use them. Hey, I'm willing to pay you more. You're asking $1,300. I'm willing to pay even $1,400 a month if you can give me this property. I'm willing to pay up front. I'll give you 6 months in advance. I'll pay you in cash. What? No. Hang up the phone. Right. Other things, some fraudsters, what they'll do is they will put in an erroneous ID, and what will happen is they will spell the name on the application for background check purposes. That's like they'll use someone who's got a confusing last name, so like Kazimpowitz, right? Only like they'll put an extra M in on the application so that when you go run a criminal records search, it doesn't find anyone with records with that last name, but then their name on their license won't have that extra M in there. And so that's a way for them to get through the system and for no criminal record potentially to show up. And you still kind of verify their license. So you've got there's just so many different things that people know the tricks to that you just got to be looking out for.
Kind of blows your mind to think what people will do, but
it's true. It's out there. And then what happens is one of these guys gets through, right? These criminal masterminds, they're like, and then they tell all their criminal buddies like, hey, go over to this property or this company over here. They're not checking. Yeah. They're not checking for this. Right. Like instead of getting denied at all these other places, just go to apply to this property. So I'll be thinking about that. Yeah. Let's see. And then, when it comes to the whole reason we're doing this, right, is then you hopefully set someone up for a good move-in experience, and just make sure you're continuing to follow those same proper procedures through move-in. So, ultimately we do work as property managers. We work for the owner, but really we owe it to the tenant to be thoughtful and skillful and abide by the law and be fair. And so that's something for you to be thinking about too, is, even though it's your asset, it's your money, it's your wallet that you're protecting, you do owe it to the tenant to provide them a good experience all the way up and through move out and the rest of the lease, etc.
And we've said this before, and it bears repeating. If you're fair and most importantly consistent with what you're doing across the board, consistent in your communication to any potential tenants, consistent in your communication across the board, you're going to set yourself up for success that way.
Absolutely. Anything else you want to do? Wrap up, Jesse? I mean, that's kind of what we had to talk about.
Yeah.
We're there already. I know. Look at the surprise.
Look at that. Usually we're always trying to wonder how long are these going to go. Sometimes it's 20 minutes. Sometimes it's an hour and a half. We never really know. But I know this was good. A good discussion. A lot of things to take away, I'd say, from this episode. Really, tenant screening and then ultimately selecting the right tenant can make or break you as a property manager, as a landlord. So you want to make sure you're screening appropriately. You want to make sure you're advertising appropriately within the context of everything with fair housing that we discussed before. Think of those 7 protected classes. Go back earlier in this episode or listen to our other episode where we talked about that in detail if you have extra questions about that. Look out for those red flags like Chris talked about. People will try just about anything, I think, to get by, to skirt through something. So look out for that. Make sure you have a framework and a plan in place for what you're going to be doing. And then again, just be consistent with it.
Yeah. And hey, at the end of the day, if you're just feeling like, man, this is way too much work, or I am so afraid I'm going to step on some sort of legal landmine that I don't even know about, hey, that's why we're here.
Yep.
Give us a call. Sunnon Property Management, SUNNON. We'd be more than happy to chat with you, see whether or not we might be a good fit for you, and see if there's something we could do to help you out. So happy to do that too. Yeah. And I guess with that, we really, really, really appreciate you taking the time to listen. Please, please take the time, just a few seconds, to click on one of those stars. Hopefully it's 5, but if not, we'd love your feedback regardless. Tell us what you thought. Drop us a line at podcast@investmentpropertygeeks.com and or hit the subscribe button as well, and make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes and valuable little nuggets. And with that, this is Chris and Jesse wishing you a brighter life through real estate.